In order to do this, we're going to need to open up the application using a text editor or an IDE, and I like to use TextMate. So I can do mate dot to open up the current directory in TextMate. You can see one of the nice things that happens when you open up a directory in TextMate is it gives you this gutter by default that has the application directory structure. Now, ordinarily, I actually close this thing down because at this point I know this directory structure well enough that I navigate using a secondary technique, and I'll be using that technique later on in the tutorial. But for now, I'm going to be navigating explicitly to the files that we want to look at just to reinforce the directory structure. So in this case, I want to go to demo app, which is just the root of the application, also called the Rails root, and then look at the config directory, and I'm going to look at routes.rb. Remember, in this model view controller pattern, when we hit /users with the browser, it goes through the Rails router. So this is the Rails router, or this is the file that defines the things that the Rails router does. Now, don't worry about what this first line does. In fact, don't worry about how anything here does anything. But what you want to know is that there's the line here that says resources users. This is the line that actually creates a bunch of routes. So right now, we're dealing with a single route, which is /users being routed to the right place inside of the Rails application. We'll see in a couple of minutes that this one line, this resources users, actually creates a whole bunch of routes all at once. Okay, let's take a look at the source code corresponding to this controller, this users controller, because /users gets routed to the index action in that controller. So we should expect to see something called index inside a file called userscontroller.rb. So this is a Ruby file here, but so far we've only seen Ruby files that have what might be considered sort of non-standard structure, in the sense that they don't necessarily look like Ruby files, or at least the Ruby files that we'll usually be dealing with in this tutorial. But this file is a very much a standard Ruby file because it defines what's called a Ruby class. So let's look at it. It's demo app, controllers, and here is users controller. Now there is tons of code here. It's horrible and ugly. In fact, it's so ugly that I'm going to suppress it right now. Oh, that's so much better. Maybe it's more confusing now that I've suppressed it, but there's so much stuff here that you don't need to deal with. What you do need to deal with is that there is right here something called index. So what happens when you hit /users is it gets routed by the Rails router into this index action. Now, an action is just a Ruby function. And we'll be covering this a lot more throughout this tutorial, especially in Chapter 4, which will talk a lot more about Ruby. But let's take a look at this right now. And there's a whole bunch of horrible, ugly stuff that I hate that I'm going to get rid of, because this actually works fine without all of that stuff. So let's take a look at this. What does this one line say? So what happens when we hit /users, it gets routed to this function. And what this function does is it defines a new variable called @users. Now, we'll see in a minute what this @ buys us, but instead of looking at the @users part, let's focus right now on user.all. Now, remember, we're trying to model a user in this application. So our data model is a user model, and in this case, this capital user is the user model class. And the user model class has what's called a method. We're calling it with a dot here. This is the standard Ruby syntax for a method call. And that method is called all. And if you look back at the diagram, you can see that the controller gets the request through /users, through the router, to the index action, and then it calls user.all, and that talks to the model. Remember, this capital user is the model. So let's take a look at the model file. It's in app models user.rb. So that's really, I mean, it's kind of disappointing. There's nothing there. But what this tells us is that there's actually a lot going on for free here. We don't have to do any work. This little symbol, this less than sign, is the way that Ruby handles inheritance. Now, I'm talking about a lot of ideas from object-oriented programming here. So if you don't have a background in object-oriented programming, there's going to be a lot going by right now, but it will eventually sink in. We'll be covering this over and over again throughout this tutorial, so don't worry if you don't catch it all right now. If you have done a lot of object-oriented programming, then all you need to know is that this is how you define a class in Ruby, and this is the inheritance operator. And this active record base is a class defined by Rails itself. Active record is the library or it's the default library that Rails uses to talk to databases, and active record base is the base class in active record. And among many other things, one of the things that active record gets you is a method called all, so that if you call user.all, it returns a list or a Ruby array of all of the users in the database. So that's this part of the diagram. What happens is the model is in charge of talking to the database. So the model talks to the database and says, hey, give me all your users, and the database returns those users. And then the model returns through the user.all method a list of all the users back to the controller. And so then the controller captures that list in a variable called @users. Now this @ sign is an indication that the @users variable is what's called an instance variable in Ruby, and it has a particular role to play in classes. But with respect to a Rails application, what's important to know is that an instance variable is automatically available in the views. So what are the views? Well, views are essentially just web pages. So @users gets passed to the view. In this case, it's index.html.erb. Notice that the name of the file corresponds to the name of the action. So let's see if we can find it. See if you can guess where it is. It's in app, views, users, index.html.erb. Now this isn't quite an HTML file. HTML is a hypertext markup language. It's the universal formatting language for web pages. This isn't quite an HTML file, and there's a hint because it's not just .html, it's .html.erb, and here ERB stands for embedded Ruby. So Rails lets you actually embed Ruby code inside of HTML files, thus forming a dynamic template that lets you generate HTML dynamically. In this case, there's absolutely no reason you should be expected to understand this line particularly right now, but you might be able to guess what it does. This says @users each do user. So with each user in @users, make a table. This is a table, table row, table data, and we've got a name, email, and then links to show, edit, and destroy. So this syntax here is embedded Ruby, and we'll be talking about this a lot more throughout the rest of the tutorial. Let's take a look at the web page again. Let me hide the gutter here for a moment. You can see that we've got name, email, and then the 3 links that we saw before. And so this is the view part of Model View Controller. And so what happens is this dynamic content, this embedded Ruby, gets converted to plain HTML and then gets passed back to the browser, and the browser then renders it as a web page. So now that we've got an idea of what one particular request looks like, that is to say, a request for the /users URL, let's take a look at another way of looking at this, which is to look at all of the different URLs that we hit in the process of that tour through the users resource. So this is a list of routes corresponding to a bunch of different URLs. Now let's take a look at the structure of these routes. Well, there's a URL called /users, which is the index action, and that's the one we just covered. That's the page to list all users. Then there's /user/1. That's the page to show user with ID 1. We talked about that. Remember, the page that showed a form to create a new user was /users/new. And we also saw the edit page, /users/1/edit. But so what's up with this other stuff? What's up with this /users here, /users/1/users/1? It looks like these URLs are actually used in multiple places. Well, that's true, but notice that there's another column here, the HTTP request. So the HTTP, the Hypertext Transfer Protocol, defines four basic actions or four basic verbs that correspond to particular operations on the web. And they're actually a little bit more general than their usage in a Rails application, but with respect to Rails applications, there are four verbs corresponding to four discrete actions. The first most common one is a GET request. Now, a GET request is simply the default kind of request on the web. It's just what happens when you click on a link in a web browser. In fact, you might have even noticed the language I use. I say we're getting this URL /users. That wasn't a coincidence. It's because it really is a GET request. So this request says, please just get this page. But notice that there are three other kinds of requests. So get /users goes to the index action and returns a page to list all users. If you post to /users, that creates a new user. So post is the default request issued by a web form. Whenever you submit a web form, it issues a post request to the server. So let's go back to our controller file to see how this works. So post /users gets routed to the create action. Let's take a look at that. So this is just too horrible for words. But the point is that if you go to new user and then you submit this form, what's happening is it's going to the create action. And the reason the way it goes to the create action is it gets routed there by the routes file. So what this resources users line does is effectively set up this table. That's what that line does. Resources users sets up a table of URLs, HTTP requests, and actions, and says, if you hit me with a GET request, I'm going to route. If you hit me with a GET request for /users, I'm going to route you to index. If you hit me with a POST request for /users, I'm going to route you to the create action. And if you get /users/1, then this router will route you to the show action. Remember, go back to the controller here. You can see we've got index, we've got show. But if you put to /users/1, the router routes you to the update action, which, as you can guess, updates a user. So when we go to, well, so let's see, when we go to edit a user, if we click on this button, what it's doing is issuing a put request to the server, in this case, the server that's running on our local development machine. Now, I should mention that web forms in general can only submit post requests, but Rails uses a little trickery to fake a put request so that on the server side it looks like the web browser is issuing a put request, and so it can be routed properly. If you put to /users/1, or in this case /users/4, then it will update that user. So you can actually take a look at how that works. If you look at the source code for this, here's the form, and here's /users/4. So the URL here is /users/4/edit, but where it's actually posting to is /users/4. And like I said, it's a post, but what's happening is Rails is faking a put request. It's not fake. Rails is arranging. I shouldn't say fake it. Rails is arranging for a put request to happen. And finally, if you get /users/1, you go to show. If you put /users/1, you get routed to to update. But if you issue a delete request to /users/1, then that gets routed to the destroy action. So there's a destroy action here at the bottom, and what that does, of course, is destroy a user. So that's what these links do. Now, again, you can't issue anything but a GET request or a POST request from a web browser, but Rails has a way of making it issue a delete request. Incidentally, those destroy links will only work if you have JavaScript enabled. There's a trick for destroying things if you don't have JavaScript enabled, but that's actually beyond the scope of this tutorial. But if you're worried about that, there are plenty of resources out on the web to tell you how to do that. So this is sort of a whirlwind tour over these URLs. This is a very common structure for developing web applications nowadays. This was not always the structure, though. This is a structure that has crystallized just in the last few years, and it goes by the name of REST, which stands for Representational State Transfer. And you can read more about this at the Ruby on Rails tutorial book, but for the purposes of Rails applications, what you need to know about REST is that REST consists of this structure of URLs, actions, and HTTP requests. It was not always the case that this structure was obeyed. In fact, my first Ruby on Rails tutorial book called Railspace went out of date like within 6 months of coming out because the REST revolution hit just after we finished the book. But one of the great things is that this really has become the standard, and so I'm confident that at least for quite a while, Rails applications will be structured this way. So if you learn this and learn it well, then it will pay great dividends in the future. Now, of course, if you think about what we're doing here, it's actually pretty cool. We've actually created users, and we've stored them in a database, and we're pulling them out in a dynamic way. But there are a lot of weaknesses of this. So let's take a look at some of the weaknesses. So what are some problems with this? Well, one of the things you'll notice is that you can create a new user that has any sort of attributes at all. So for example, ordinarily on a web application, you would want the name not to be blank, for example, and you would want the email to be valid. But if I say invalid email with a space in it and click create user, it doesn't complain at all. It just creates that user. So one of the basic things you want in a web application is some sort of data validations, and this doesn't have anything like that. Also notice that anybody can create a user, anybody can edit a user or destroy a user. There's no sense of authentication. There's no authorization required to do anything. You can't log in. Registration consists of clicking on new user. So that's a major problem with this sort of toy application. There also aren't any tests here, or actually there aren't any tests that we've written. The scaffolding actually does create some rudimentary tests, but they're really ugly and inflexible. In any case, they don't test for the kinds of things that you would want to test for in a real application, such as data validations and authentication and authorization. Also notice that there's no sort of consistent layout or styling of the site. This isn't a real web application. It's a nice overview, but it's this no one would ever mistake this for a real website. And really, finally, the biggest problem is that there's no real understanding. I mean, just look at this thing. This is a debacle. So what we're going to do throughout the rest of this tutorial is build a sample application from the ground up, so that you understand things at every stage, rather than just dumping all this code on you at once.